Basics of Gait, Part 4. This serves as the final chapter in our series and is a direct companion to Part 3. We have discussed the foundations of bipedal gait in humans and how unique it is in the animal kingdom. We went over the various types of reactions involved in maintaining an upright posture, and explored the neural pathways that provide information to update our internal postural schema. Now, we will go over how the nervous system actually makes these adjustments. We call these descending pathways because they come from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and go down to the rest of the body, though the actual directionality is not necessarily down in the strict gravitational sense. Most of our attention will be on the brain here. Now that we have updated our internal postural schema, if the state the brain is in doesn't match where it wants to be, adjustments need to be made. We return to this figure. In Part 3, we focused on the input systems. We now focus on these processing and output systems. It is easy to get lost in the immense amount of complexity and rich interconnectedness of all the networks and structures we will discuss in this video. Remember, our goal is to present this in a digestible manner and stay focused on postural control. Let's start at the top. Cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain and is where higher level processing occurs. Cortex can be divided simply into a few regions, or in a more complex fashion, as in Brodmann's areas of the brain wherein each area is purported to have a distinct function. In reality, brain function is fluid and dynamic. Many collections of cells are connected to many others and each modulates the other's signaling, as in our initial maze-like figure. We focus here on frontal areas of the brain and will subdivide it somewhere in between the two extremes of parcellation. This figure divides the frontal cortex into key subregions. Prefrontal cortex is typically thought of as the highest level of cognitive processing, where executive function lives. For this video, we will ignore additional subdivisions of prefrontal cortex. This general region can also be thought of as the planning area, where inputs can be compiled and compared, and different outputs can be weighed based on their potential consequences. For our purposes, this is where a conscious decision to change positions can begin based on a goal-directed series of actions. For example, a hunger cue triggers a series of position changes and movements towards the kitchen, where food is expected to be. Let's move on to the motor cortex. Motor cortex is where the brain sends its signals down to the spinal cord, where they connect to spinal motor neurons and interneurons, which in turn send their synapses out to the target muscles that will eventually move. Think of it as the doing area, where the plans of prefrontal cortex are enacted. An interesting feature of motor cortex is that only a few neurons synapse directly onto spinal motor neurons. The vast majority synapse onto interneurons, which play a role in modulating spinal reflexes. Remember the monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes we discussed in Part 2. These interneurons ensure the appropriate surrounding muscles do not contract during a reflexive movement. Think of motor cortex as both consciously telling the muscles what to do, and also tuning anticipatory postural reflexes. Not only are you consciously stepping over a stone in your path, but you are anticipating a potential series of adjustments that may come after, all the while relying on the speed of a reflex arc to make these adjustments quickly. I saved the premotor cortex for last in our journey through cortical postural control because it is more difficult to understand intuitively compared to the prefrontal and motor cortices. It is also known as the supplementary motor area, and you can think of it as a kind of intermediary between the abstract planning of prefrontal cortex and concrete actions of motor cortex. It refines signals from prefrontal cortex, but also receives information from and sends signals to other brain regions involved in movement and postural control, which we will discuss later. While all of the frontal cortex also does this, we will choose to simplify the general concept and suffice to say that premotor cortex is a way station between planning and doing for conscious postural adjustments. We move on to a group of brain structures collectively known as the basal ganglia. Each of these structures is a collection of neurons and are critical for movement of all kinds, and also play a role in many non-motor functions of the brain. They all have complex connection patterns and internal structures. If you are familiar with the basal ganglia from other neuroscience courses, you can rest easy. We will not delve deep into the mores of the direct and indirect pathways, or the parcellation of the individual nuclei here. We will instead focus on their broad functions and how this relates to postural control. The most important anatomical feature to know about the basal ganglia is that they are part of a cortico. Basal ganglia. Thalamocortical. Motor circuit as part of their primary function. The basal ganglia are involved in a wide variety of motor behaviors, including action selection and sequencing of movements. If you want to step over a rock in your path, the basal ganglia help ensure the correct muscles are activated and, importantly, inactivated in the correct order. This is an entirely unconscious process, and anyone who has attempted the browser-based game QWOP, or its variations, is thankful for this. The basal ganglia also play a role in reinforcement learning. If a certain set of movements is associated with a reward, be it as basic as acquiring tasty food, or as conceptual as the joy of winning a competition, the basal ganglia will help to reinforce the neural circuits associated with these movements. In postural control, the types of movements that lead to maintenance of an upright posture are heavily reinforced. The strong connections to cortex are paramount for updating the internal postural schema with regards to appropriate adjustments in different scenarios. The cerebellum is a complex structure whose function is often oversimplified. It is typically thought of as the coordination center of the brain, allowing for smooth and accurate movements. In medicine, the finger-nose-finger test is commonly thought of as an assessment of cerebellar function. While it is true that damage to the cerebellum can lead to jerky and inaccurate movements, there is a large body of evidence connecting the cerebellum to both motor and non-motor neurologic functions. Indeed, estimates suggest there are as many neurons in the cerebellum, which amounts to about 10% of total brain size, as there are in the entire nervous system. A complete analysis of the cerebellum is of course outside the scope of this video, and we refocus here on its role in postural control. See the description for further reading on this fascinating topic. For our purposes, we focus on the motor functions of cerebellum. Even here, the relatively small structure reveals its complexity. This figure illustrates the inputs and outputs of cerebellum, but don't worry about the particulars of the anatomy and substructures here. As you can see, there is multisensory input that arrives and is processed by cerebellar nuclei. These nuclei then project to structures throughout the brain. Notably, there are no direct projections to spinal cord. The spinocerebellar tract from part 3 is from cord to cerebellum, but the opposite path requires additional structural relays. Let's break down these cerebellar subsections in a bit more detail. The most medial aspect of the cerebellum, or spinocerebellum in this figure, receives sensory information from the trunk, eyes, and auditory system. It plays a role in reactive postural control in response to these inputs. The next area, which sits primarily on the most inferior part of the cerebellum, is the vestibulocerebellum, which, as its name suggests, participates in reactive postural control in response to primarily vestibular inputs. Finally, the most lateral aspects of the cerebellum are also its most robust and is known collectively as the cerebrocerebellum. From a motor standpoint, this is where cerebellum participates in motor learning, motor error detection, and motor error correction. With its broad connections to multiple cortical areas from both an input and output standpoint, these areas help to prepare, initiate, and execute voluntary movements with consideration for their sensory consequences. The cerebellum is a magnificently complicated structure, but we will move on from it here. Suffice to say that there is a wealth of information to be learned on this little brain that sits comfortably in the back of your head. We conclude this video with a brief discussion of the mesencephalic locomotor region, or MLR, located in the midbrain. This is typically considered a pair of structures, the pedunculopontine nucleus, or PPN, and cuneiform nucleus, or CNF. PPN is much more broadly connected to other brain structures compared to CNF, and it is structurally heterogeneous in itself. For our purposes, the more rostral portion is of greater interest. It has strong interconnectedness with basal ganglia, cortex, cerebellum, brainstem, and spinal cord. This anatomical complexity is directly correlated with functional complexity, with its motor roles ranging from maintenance of attention during ambulation to both initiation and arrest of locomotion. CNF, by contrast, is more limited in anatomical and functional scope. Its main connections are with downstream medial reticular formation structures in the brainstem. Its primary function is in the initiation of locomotion and control of speed. We arrive now at the end of our journey through the basics of human walking and balance. I'd like to emphasize again that this series was meant as a primer, or introduction to the concepts of bipedalism, postural control, and the neural structures that underlie them. We focus mostly on maintenance of balance. The structures we discussed could merit full videos, if not entire series, dedicated to exploring the details of their structure and function. Perhaps we will do just that in the future. For now, I hope you have enjoyed the walk with me. Please check the link in the description for further reading, and as always, thanks for watching.